everyone. This is Gary Berman, host of the Cyber Hero Adventure Show, coming to you with an extremely special briefing today. Phil Venables, who's the CISO of Google Cloud. Hey, Phil, welcome to the show.
Hey, no, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Indeed, and we're very excited about the topic today. You and I had a chance to meet at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's event in Washington, D.C. recently for the release of the PCAST report to the president on cyber and physical resilience. And you had so many interesting things to say, along with the other panelists, who were there. And so we thought it'd be a great idea if you can share some of your thoughts and highlights, from the report.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
So before we jump into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your origin story? One of the things we've learned about cybersecurity is there's no straight path. Everybody has sort of serpentine and very interesting ways to get to this point. How did you get to this point in your career?
Yeah, so well, I think like a lot of people of my generation on the wrong side of 50, I started doing security before it was really like the thing it is today, and so my background is software engineering in defense, energy, and various other spaces, as well as financial services. And so I first came into doing information security, or cyber security as it might be called now, off the back of actually developing secure systems, developing crypto systems, developing network security technology, and then ultimately became a security leader and a chief information security officer at various financial services companies over many years. Then I also did some chief risk officer roles and some other work. And then about 3 and a bit years ago, I came to Google to be the CISO of Google Cloud, where I cover security, privacy, compliance, risk, resilience. And then also I run various parts of security engineering for other parts of Google's technical infrastructure. So really great and interesting role now to work with customers all the way through down to working with our engineers on some of the most challenging and beneficial problems in security today. So it's a long and winding road got me here. Yeah.
Indeed, and speaking of long and winding roads, there were, if I'm not mistaken, 28 high-level people who took long and winding roads that were part of the PCAST working group. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the process and what it was like listening and learning and collaborating on this incredibly important nexus of cyber and physical security.
Yeah, so for those that you don't know, the PCAST, as we call it, is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. It's an advisory board made up of many different scientists and technology leaders that advise the president directly on a whole range of things. As PCAST in this administration, we've published reports on semiconductors, all the way through to clean energy, all the way through to important but specific things like wildfire prevention and detection. So many other reports that we've produced. But the one thing, of course, that I've been most focused on is the cyber physical resilience report. And as you kind of see on the slide up, Eric Horwitz, who's the chief scientific officer at Microsoft, and I came up with the idea of this topic and basically brought in a few of our PCAST overall colleagues, and then invited, as you see on the screen, a number of really distinguished non-PCAST members to join the working group. These working groups are a mix, and we had great input from everybody. But the background about why we set up this cyber physical resilience topic and really dug into this was, and I think most of your audience today will appreciate this, is we're continuing to digitize society, and that includes our critical infrastructure. And as part of that, digitalization of everything, we're converging cyber and physical systems, and it means our attack surface is increasing. So bringing cyber and physical together is absolutely critical, but also the resilience focus is very important. And again, I think we all realize you can never 100% defend everything. And so while we should, of course, continue to increase our defenses to stop attacks, we should at the same time assume some attacks are always going to get through. And then the question is, can we be resilient to that? Can we recover from it? Can we fight through those attacks and keep operations up of some critical services, or at least an essential part of some service, even in the face of those attacks? And so that means we also have to think about, how do we architect for resilience? How do we design our society so that we have fewer single points of failure, and not just for cyber attacks, but other types of disasters and outages? And a great example of this, some of you may remember at the beginning of last year, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, had a system outage, and this one system being out stopped most US commercial flights from taking off on the morning that this happened. And this just happened to be a misconfiguration error. It wasn't a cyber attack. But the interesting thing about this, after this one system failure essentially grounded US commercial aviation for a big part of that day, the clamor was to make sure that that system never failed again, which is not a bad goal. But really the more important goal is, why does the whole system, the whole aviation system, depend on that just one system? And why can't we solve for that resilience? And we see this pattern everywhere. Every time there's a failure that has this wide impact, we say, how can we make that failure never happen again? And of course, that's kind of futile, but you do get some improvements, and then we trust that component more, and then it fails again, and it has a bigger impact, and we keep turning the screw until we get more and more brittleness. And the report is really about, how do we pivot to resilience and to think about not just making individual components more secure and defendable, which is still important, but how do we make the whole system more resilient? And that's essentially what the report is all about.
And we're bringing in to the show George Shea. Hi, George, or Georgiana. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Gary. Thanks for having me. Hi, Phil.
Hey, good to see you again.
Indeed. And Georgiana, George, it was a very important part of the formation of the PCAS working group. And so, George, what was your motivation for participating? This was a lot of time and effort from a lot of people, right?
Well, I don't think there's really a need for motivation when the PCAS asked, hey, would you like to come and work with us on this paper? I'm like, absolutely. Just being a part of the group was an honor.
Yeah, indeed. And, I don't know if you would accept this, but I consider you a mentor. And I think that many of us in the cybersecurity ecosystem have a lot to learn about how rapidly everything's changing in the convergence of cyber and physical, right?
Oh, absolutely. I will say, so, in terms of motivation for this, I've been working in cybersecurity for, I'll just say, over 20 years. And, before it was called cybersecurity, as Phil mentioned before, and the OT side of the house, the operational technologies and the cyber physical systems really haven't gotten a lot of attention. So it was great to be able to, bring that into the spotlight and show people that this is an important issue, and we really need to tackle this, and not just focus on the cybersecurity piece of it, but again, as Phil said, that ensure that we have the resilience that these systems aren't going to fail, and that they're going to continue on, and we'll have that mission completion of wherever they're being applied.
Okay, George, thanks a lot. If you can stay on, we'll bring you in a little bit later.
Okay.
So let's jump right in, Phil. This notion of resilience, these are three main areas in the report. Tell us your thoughts about why these are three important issues.
Yeah, so one of the things that we tried to do with the report was to make it a balance of education on the problem that is being not as focused on as much as we think it should be, as well as the recommendations as well. And so what we've done is we've balanced quite a lot of deep technical recommendations, as well as addressing some of the public and private sector structural issues. So again, it's shifting this focus of attention from cybersecurity to thinking about how do we develop resilient systems overall. But the main thing in terms of the ethos of the report, as you know, with cyber, and especially cyber physical resilience, it's not just a policy issue or an organization issue. It's a very deep technical issue. And I think sometimes we shy away in these types of reports from making kind of technical recommendations. And the reality is, as all of us today will know, that solving for these issues is this combination of all of those policy, organization, and technical issues. In other words, you can make all the technical recommendations you want, but without aligning policy and resource changes to support that, then they'll go nowhere. And similarly, on the flip side, you can make all the policy recommendations you want, but unless you get somewhere into the weeds of exactly what technical changes are needed, then real things won't change. And I think we've tried to focus in this report of really helping people understand the need for that balance. And again, when you think about this nexus of cyber physical and critical infrastructure, again, most of our critical infrastructure, whether it's energy, health, water, telecoms, public services, even finance is cyber physical these days. More and more of it has been computerized for all the reasons like efficiency, remote manageability, improved sensory coverage, systems integration. And a big part of this, especially in sectors like energy and utilities like water and health, is the ability of IT systems to manage and control physical infrastructure. And this confluence of IT and operational technology is the nexus that contains a lot of this risk, as many of these things and many of these original components have been designed without a lot of security rigor. They were designed with the assumption that they would never be connected to everything else. And now we're actually, as a society, have connected all these things together, and they were never designed for that. And so we now face all of these security and resiliency consequences of how do we retrofit or redesign and build anew things with security and resilience in mind. And so I think this is the focus of everything, wider focus on cyber physical and wider focus on resilience.
Indeed, and these systems are so complex and large that you can't really do like a sort of rip and replace, easily. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, exactly. And you got to look at that. It's that systems thinking approach to these things, which is all of these components interact, and many of the security and resilience challenges are emergent properties that come from this complex interaction of all of these components that weren't necessarily designed to interact with each other in the first place. And which is why the tone of the report is all about how do we think about systems-wide goals as opposed to just individual component goals.
Indeed. And so there were a series of recommendations that emanated, from this report. Maybe you can share with us your thoughts on establishing performance goals. I thought that was quite interesting and useful.
Yeah, so this is probably the main aspect of the report, and it is to really call out the need to define and establish what we essentially call minimum viable operating goals and delivery objectives. And this may seem like a simple concept, but it can be very, very powerful. So if we were to pick just one possible example, imagine we could say no more than 50,000 people will ever be without some resource, say clean drinking water or electricity or something else, for more than 1 week. Now, that's clearly a laudable goal. You'd probably like that to cover more people for less time, but let's say that's the goal. Then all of the people and organizations collectively responsible for delivering that, they need to look at that not just as an abstract goal. They need to look at that as something that absolutely has to be delivered. And so they need to then look at all of the hazards that might prevent that goal from being maintained. It also means they have to look at how that might operate in degraded states, what single points of failure could compromise that minimum viable delivery goal. They've got to look across supply chains. They've got to contemplate what emergency manual controls might be needed in the event that we lose network connectivity to that infrastructure that is delivering that essential public service. And so we've got to look at everything to ensure that the delivery objective can be met. And the other aspect of this is, a part of this is getting to grips with it's okay to operate in a degraded state in the midst of some event, whether it's cyber or physical or some natural disaster or some outage, to think about how you can absolutely not necessarily always keep 100% of the service operating in a 100% way, but at least keeping the minimum viable objective of that service to that goal running in at least some degraded state. I'll give you an example. A finance example is kind of easy to imagine. So imagine if we could say to the financial system, no matter what attacks or resiliency events are happening, then we should always be able to prioritize sustaining, for example, basic credit card, debit card payments so people can buy things. We should know how to absolutely sustain making payroll and getting social security payments. But perhaps we can go longer, maybe much longer, without issuing new mortgages or launching an IPO or doing an M&A transaction. So distinguishing what's minimum viable, critical, and what has to be operational, and running the system in a degraded state to just deliver that while we figure out much later about how to recover everything else is a key distinction. And that's what this minimum viable operating goal is all about.
Well, and just to build on that in a different example that has significant consequences, what would this look like in healthcare, for example, like a 400-bed hospital?
Yeah, well, so this could be, for example, making sure that those systems can operate without network connectivity. So imagine, it's surprising today, whether it's in health or other sectors, how many devices, how many systems require some connectivity, whether it's over private networks or the internet, to some environment to keep them up and running. Yet in a wide-scale disaster, we would probably want medical devices or medical diagnostic equipment, or outside of healthcare, other types of process control systems, to be able to operate without the presence of a network, and to be able to be administered locally in some degraded mode to keep them up and running. And that could be one example. Other examples could be, how do you make sure you can keep security segmented and isolated so that people don't have excess privilege across that environment? And that may involve some adjustment of how the supply chain is set up between all those systems. So there's many, many ways. And again, when you take that lens of focusing on how do we look at all of the hazards to a system that may impact the minimum viable delivery objective, you start to look at what are the approaches to take against those hazards that are a lot different than what you might come up with through a traditional type of analysis.
This notion of radical transparency, that's a tough one, because you have, laws, state, federal, global laws, you have intellectual property. How do you inculcate a culture of radical transparency?
Yeah, so we kind of walked a fine line in the report on this. So our belief as a working group was that if you make the current situation in whatever environment, whether it's resilient or not resilient, if you bring some transparency to that, then incentives, market forces, maybe just the sheer guilt of owners and operators not being as good as they thought they were in the eyes of the public may cause some self-correction. There's been some examples in the past with things like some of the environmental acts that came out in the 80s and 90s didn't require certain standards to be kept, but they required owners and operators of, say, chemical plants to disclose their pollutants to their local communities, which caused the transparency to cause the demand for that to be corrected and reduced rather than an explicit target being set. So we believe this transparency drives corrective actions, but we all know in security there's a balance there where you don't want to be so transparent and so broadly publicized of critical vulnerabilities, such that you're just kind of advertising how to attack yourself. So in the report, we balance the need for stressing that organizations in partnership with their relevant government agency should disclose where they're at on some of these performance goals. And this kind of echoes the work that DHS are doing already on cyber performance goals, to look at bringing that transparency to just let people know where they fit with everybody else. That will drive that self-correction. Ultimately, I think we should get to more radical transparency, but that's going to be a journey.
And this notion of stress testing, tabletop exercises, things like that, what are the incentives that an organization would need to test their systems?
Right. Well, it's a great question on incentives, because again, what we tried to do in the report was, many reports like this are full of recommendations like do security because it's the right thing to do, which of course is true. But one of the things I think, again, a more mature way of looking at this is both for security and resilience. There's many, many commercial incentives for doing this. So security and resilience implemented in the right way not only means that you're supporting customers more, you're supporting the public more, you're delivering your goals in more commercial ways. But you probably, to get that right, you have to do things in a way that also complement business goals around agility, productivity, efficiency, many, many other things. So there's no reason why some of these things can't be done. And the great thing about kind of stress testing is if you're an executive at a company or on the board or a security or resiliency leader, we all know that you don't really know how well your systems are going to perform under a certain scenario until you inflict that scenario on them. So one of the things, I've known a few companies that have done this, they literally just disconnect their systems from the internet and see what happens. And they go into that exercise going, well, of course they'll continue working without the presence of the internet, at least for some period of time. And then lo and behold, when they do that, they find that there's some weird component that happens to be talking back to the vendor over the internet to get some diagnostic update.
Exactly.
And it just breaks. And they go, well, that was weird. Why did that break? And so until tabletops are like vitally important, and conventional business continuity planning is vitally important, but stress testing these things, at least on a subset or a special setup of your systems to really understand their behavior under extreme stress, you learn many things. And in fact, many of the things you learn have massive commercial benefits. In some cases, they have efficiency and cost reduction benefits as well. But ultimately, stressing the thing is important. And many sectors do this for other risks. The financial sector and other sectors are well known for their kind of so-called stress tests of how they subject themselves to extreme events to simulate and model whether they could survive those events. It's a healthy exercise.
Yeah, and it also, it demonstrates that the organization is taking reasonable care, from a fiduciary, perspective. So, what about the second recommendation? R&D, in the cybersecurity ecosystem. I love the observatory. Maybe you can just share your thoughts through these items.
Yeah. So there's the good news is, across many of our government R&D apparatus and all of the so-called advanced research projects agencies, whether it's DARPA, IARPA, Health ARPA, Infrastructure ARPA, Homeland Security ARPA, there's all of these kind of groups, and they're all working on some element. They're clearly all working on security, but they're also all working on some elements of resilience as well, and resilience in the way we've been talking about it today. And we think there's a lot of opportunity for government, not necessarily to kind of fold this stuff together. I think having things kind of independent and proceeding with their own goals is actually, is more kind of entrepreneurial and delivers more things. But we recommend there should be some alignment between that so that we're getting maximum benefit from all of the individual activities, and so we can line them up more. But one of the things that we did focus on, as you called out in this recommendation, and this is one of the big things in the report that's attracted a lot of attention, is the need to create what we call a National Critical Infrastructure Observatory. And so this is effectively, you can think of this as somewhat like a digital twin of United States critical infrastructure. So how do we get a real-time view of actually what critical infrastructure looks like? And this came from the idea that was confirmed by conversations with many people that our adversaries probably know more through mapping and scanning of our infrastructure than we collectively know ourselves. And that's clearly a problem. So we want, through DHS, through the National Risk Management Center and other groups, to work to create this National Critical Infrastructure Observatory, which will be a system that we can use to introspect and look at what does our critical infrastructure look like, so that we can then use that to say, what are the dependencies? What are the third, fourth, fifth party dependencies? What's the concentration risk? We could even point various types of AI at this to look, can detect sequences of attacks that might not be predictable to any individual one user of one element of that system. So this observatory will, could be used operationally, it could be used from a risk analysis perspective, but we think having more visibility of ourselves than our attackers have of us is going to give us more capability to identify risks and mitigate those risks ahead of us finding out they're a problem during an attack.
And if memory serves me, when that came up during the briefing, I think the actual country reference was China. There's something like, China has better, or probably has better, sort of visibility into our systems that we do. And, I think given geopolitical things at the moment, it'd be great to get this observatory. We have a lot of questions and a lot of interest from the audience. So I'm going to, at this moment, invite David to the stage. And David, do you want to just say hi and introduce yourself?
Sure, Gary. Thanks. And great to see you, Phil. I think the last time we spoke, it was down at 85 Broad Street, actually. So good to see all of this fine work that's being done here. And Georgiana, good to see you as well. When we talk about resilience, what is and I know that a lot of the effort here was geared towards establishing why resilience is important. I mean, it's somewhat embarrassing to all of us, I guess, in our profession that we still have to do that and sort of prove the case, if you will. But there are those who are kind of new to this discussion. They may not know, et cetera. It's important to socialize these concepts. But getting from that baseline of, fine, resilience is important. It has value for the enterprise, which goes back, Phil, to your comment about incentives. And certainly monetary value is one of the best incentives known in this market. But how do we measure resilience? What are the thoughts on how, and we do a lot of work in this area, obviously, and had done some work on actually United Healthcare, Change Healthcare about a year ago, that actually forecast the losses that we're seeing now. But what are kind of the metrics or ways to measure resilience? So I'm out here as an enterprise and I say, well, all of this sounds wonderful. I really want to get on this and incorporate this and embed it into my thinking around my cyber strategies, et cetera. But how do I know how far down that path I actually am? What are some good metrics or ways of evaluating that, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the kind of the obvious way that you'll have obviously concluded, and people are already doing it today, is just literally direct measurement of an assessment under stress or not of whether you can achieve that stated minimum viable delivery objective. So I think that there's that, and I think that's slightly different, as I mentioned before, from kind of conventional business continuity planning, because you're then looking at it, it's more like how some of the finance organizations think of operational resilience. It's not just the recovery of a component, but how do you operate an end-to-end system, perhaps in a degraded state, while you're recovering components. So there's the ability to measure that. But one of the things we also called out extensively in the report was the need to move specific performance metrics from being lagging indicators to leading indicators. Now, many of the lagging indicators that we all know, it's, kind of outages, breaches, malware events, intrusions, vulnerabilities, all those things that are important to measure. But the things that our contention is that what really makes a difference is how do you measure how well you're doing on the leading indicators of structuring environment for it to be more secure and resilient. So let me give you an example. In the report, I think we list about kind of 10 very specific examples. But one example I'll give is software reproducibility. So what percentage of your software do you have the ability to reproduce in a reliable and secure way at will? And so we all aspire to do that. There's very few organizations that have a great record of being able to catalog, manage, and reproducibly build all of their software. Many organizations are working to that. So then you think, well, what the hell's that got to do with security and resilience? Well, as I think you will know, and most of the audience will know, is if you can do that, you can make changes quicker, you can make security changes quicker, you can roll back, you can roll forward, you can manage your software base, you can manage your software risk. So it gives you more agility and resilience in the face of needing to change. And that's just kind of one example. Another example, which we touched on, was the ability to operate in a communication denied environment, internet or otherwise, or the ability to reliably not just recover your system from backups, but cold start, essentially reboot your organization from nothing. How can you do that, and what time does it take to do that? And so these are a set of things, and it's the analogy I always use. It's a bit like, manufacturing. So you think the best manufacturers in the world, they don't just monitor the quality of products coming off the production line. Oh, of course they do. What they really, really focus on is monitoring the quality of the input, the quality of the machinery, the production management process, the maintenance of the machines, so that if you do all the leading indicators right, you almost can't help but get the good outcomes. And I think we need to pay more attention in security and resilience to what's those leading indicator measures that are typically not direct security measures. They're measures of infrastructure, software health, business process health. That if you get all those things right, you can't help but have the great resilience outcomes. And to your point about incentives, when you do all those things, they carry immense adjacent benefits of efficiency, productivity, agility. Again, if you've got great means of reproducibly managing your software lifecycle and your software infrastructure, you can do great security things. You can also add dozens of business features per day, without fear of change or operating risk. So all of these leading indicators give you security and resilience, but they give you massive other benefits as well. And I think shifting from lagging to leading indicators is also pretty transformative.
So David, thanks so much. We appreciate you being here. And there's so much to go through. Let me just go to the third recommendation. And see what you think about this notion of breaking down silos and strengthening the governance cyber, physical resilience capacity.
Yeah. So, again, you all know that, especially here in the US, but not uniquely the US, critical infrastructure is typically owned and operated by the private sector, and it's overseen in collaboration, or in some cases direct regulation from the government as well. One of the interesting challenges and opportunities of this space is that pretty much every part of government is involved in this. So we've not only got great work going on from agencies like CISA in DHS, or the Office of the National Cyber Director, or the National Security Council, or the National Security Agency, FBI, many other groups that are focused on security. But essentially, every part of our critical infrastructure is covered by one of these so-called sector risk management agencies. So, for example, this would be Department of Treasury for Finance, Energy for Energy, Health and Human Services, and FDA and others for the health and medical and pharmaceutical industries. And one of the things we observed was, while there's been a lot of increase in resources in various of these agencies, there are many sector risk management agencies that just don't have enough people or don't have enough expertise to really deliver what they need to be delivering in terms of driving their sector to have improved cyber physical resilience. And so the report calls out, as part of a refresh of PPD 21 and some other government actions, to really look at how do each agency staff their sector risk management agency functions appropriately, and keep going with that partnership with the central teams at CISA and other groups, and in fact the teams at DHS and CISA that act as a sector risk management agency for certain sectors. And then finally, we've also got to say, like, the government doesn't necessarily have, in all cases, enough authority to dictate to the private sector certain minimum standards. So I don't think necessarily laws and regulation are the answer to everything. But I certainly think for many parts of critical infrastructure that are not regulated, there probably should be some more regulation that sets and encodes that kind of minimum set of standards. And I think this administration has been doing quite a lot of work on that as well.
Well, just to build on that point, also, one of the things that we're doing here is we're launching the Cyber Hero V CISO network, the purpose of which is to provide fractional and virtual CISOs the opportunity to actually help, implement the government policies, and just to assess where the millions of critical infrastructure organizations are along their risk curve, and to assess their risk posture at the moment, and to have, very high level talent that can actually help them implement, what they need to do to get to the next point. And one of our colleagues I'm inviting into the stream right now, Robert Hill, is developed an amazing platform to help do that. So Robert, you have a question for Phil about like how do you assess where an organization is, and how do we just sort of support the recommendations in the PCAST report?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gary. And Phil, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining today. My question really becomes, we've talked about incentives versus punitive consequences. We've talked about how to incentivize these organizations to adopt a framework, to be able to adopt that process of resiliency versus just compliance, because we all know compliance has been a checkbox, and compliance is not equal security. So, Phil, what are you finding as the driving motivators for these organizations that have not been typically, like law firms and others, have not typically been under a framework or under specific, as you just said, requirements, whether they're mandated by regulatory within an industry sector or by the government? What do you find as that driving motivator now, as we're beginning to see companies involve the business in the side of cybersecurity and no longer just relegating it to be an IT problem and accepting that there's actionable business risks, just as we've seen, like right now while we're having this conversation, there is, the healthcare subcommittees. So what are you seeing as those driving motivators for these companies to begin to start looking at resiliency? Is it the SEC holding, personal accountability to those executives? What are those driving motivators that are allowing or causing companies to now take this paradigm shift and the business accept some responsibility and start implementing these types of frameworks and resiliency substructures within their organization?
Yeah, I mean, so you hit many of the points in there, which is, so there's various kind of things that drive incentives. So I think for many industries, it's regulatory. So if you look particularly finance and some other industries are quite well covered by multiple different regulators in multiple different jurisdictions for multiple different products that set a set of baseline standards and set a set of expectations for board through management and the security team engagement on risk management. I think, to your point, some of the recent activities of the SEC, particularly on requiring more transparency around cyber risks and incident disclosure for at least public companies, is also driving a different degree of conversation in the boardroom. Again, as you all know, many large organizations have had a quite long-standing, fairly mature process, but for many other organizations, some of the actions of the SEC is driving some of those deeper conversations about the interplay between business risk and technology and security risk and resiliency. And so I think that's driving that. The other thing that we also see some of the drivers is, again, that around some of the topics I covered in that leading indicator conversation, where CISOs and CIOs are partnering ever closer because they're both of those groups are realizing that if you can get some of these underlying technology, agility implementations done, if you can modernize some of your technology to an architecture that's much more defendable, then it gives you commercial benefits as well as security and resilience benefits. So people are seeing that. And then also people approaching security and resiliency in commercial ways to think about, how does this mean I can support my customers better? More and more customers are requiring of their vendors that they commit to particular contractually required service levels, and clearly resilience helps with that. But also, again, as you all know, doing security well also means doing it well means reducing customer friction. Doing resiliency well means that customers get to trust you more. So I think boards and the C-suite in general are realizing the intersection between resilience and security and commercial objectives, whether or not you happen to be regulated. Now, clearly, the onus is on the risk teams and the security teams to understand how to articulate what they need to happen, not just in security and resiliency terms, but in commercial terms, or in the case of public sector organizations, in mission terms as well. And so I think as long as we are all approaching that conversation in those kind of practical ways with a mind for what the adjacent benefits are, I think the incentives become apparent. But again, let's not kid ourselves. Regulation and stipulation in many sectors goes a long way to get the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. And speaking of regulations and things like that, I want to bring into the stream Arturo. He's the head of cybersecurity for Amtrak. Did I get that right, Arturo? I just want to get your title right.
It's head of cybersecurity architecture for Amtrak. Yes.
Yeah. So you have a thought or question for Phil?
I do. I was we work with critical infrastructure, of course, in trains for trains and the railroad systems. And one of the challenges that we have is the sharing threat intelligence. Despite CISO's efforts as initiatives, organizations are reluctant to do real-time threat intelligence exchange. So my question is, if there are other means to incentivize the critical infrastructure organizations to exchange threat intelligence, or if it will just come down to regulation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that there's two ways of looking at threat intelligence. There's what you might call the macro and the micro. So I kind of think about micro threat intelligence. It's all of the kind of the indicators of compromise, the signatures, the IP addresses of attackers, the signatures of particular malware or scans or attacks. It's that kind of the stuff that we would seek to wire together to share electronically so that one attack observed somewhere can inform the defenses of another organization. So there's micro threat intelligence. And I think that I don't think most organizations should have to figure out how to share that with each other. And again, I'll be careful here because, my organization sells products in this space. I actually, so I won't make it a pitch, but I do think that the lot should be expected of the technology companies and security vendors and platforms out there in partnership with the industry ISACs and the other information sharing analysis organizations, the ISAOs, to just basically wire the system together so that we're able to share it's almost like a digital immune system. You want one attack observed somewhere to feed some intelligence to a defensive system before the attackers get to that next system. And I think we can collectively wire that together. For example, we've been partnering with a number of the ISACs to tie in Google threat intelligence into the various ISAC threat exchanges, as well as doing it in our own products and actually in partnership with some other tech vendors and security vendors to wire the intelligence together. So I think there's that. I think the second thing, though, is there's always this notion of macro threat intelligence, which to some extent is some of the most important thing, which is the broader threat analysis of what attackers are doing and where they're going and evolving their TTPs that can inform us as security leaders as to how to position ourselves to get ahead of whole classes of attacks. And I think that's where partnership with government agencies, particularly CISA, maybe the NSA Cyber Collaboration Center, whether it's directly or through the ISACs or the sector coordinating councils, getting those classified briefings of where the attackers are going to then give you the information that you can work with your executive leadership to take more dramatic steps. So for example, we can all share micro threat intelligence of the latest types of phishing attacks, but we shouldn't really have to care about that, because we should all be implementing strong two-factor cryptographic phishing-resistant authentication pervasively across our companies. Now, that's an easy thing to say, but we all know, business leaders may not want to commit to that expense, or our user communities may not want to commit to the perceived inconvenience of using hardware tokens versus passwords. But we as security people know that doing that will eliminate whole classes of attacks, and somehow getting that threat intelligence of that's what attackers are going to be doing more and more to defeat conventional authentication, getting that to our boards and executives in the form of intelligence briefings to get them to commit to the more dramatic implementations of the whole classes of control uplift we need to do. I think that macro threat intelligence is the thing that really drives us forward. And, I'd be, happy to kind of talk more, directly or, with groups of you around how to think about doing that.
Well, Phil, you must know, forgive the interruption, Arturo, you must know that this is going to be a series that we're doing here. So whether or not you like it or not, you have to come back, all right? Arturo, thanks a lot. So this is the fourth recommendation, to develop a greater industry board, CEO, and executive accountability. This is an incredibly important topic. And one of the things that I heard from the briefing was it's not just like shift left, but it's shift up, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the big thing here, and we've kind of touched on a lot of this because of the questions, is the fact that all of this critical infrastructure is mostly owned and operated by the private sector. We can't just expect more of government. We've got to expect more of ourselves in the private sector. And when you think about what's expected of boards and CEOs, the thing we say in the report is we need to join the tone at the top from the boards and the CEOs with actual resources in the ranks in their organizations to get things done. It's no good a board member or a CEO saying cyber resilience and security is the most important thing if that doesn't actually translate into the resources or prioritization in their organization to actually implement the things that stand behind it being a significant priority for that organization. And so, I think we all know situations where senior leaders have said it's important, but then it doesn't turn into an actual implementation. Thankfully, we also know many examples where senior leaders say that and they absolutely back it up, that take that tone at the top to resources in the ranks to get things implemented. One of the things specifically in these recommendations, we're calling out the need for each of the critical infrastructure sector coordinating councils, which are these private sector organizations in each sector made up of a variety of companies in that sector. We're asking that the government partner with the private sector to make sure each of those sector coordinating councils not necessarily is made up of board members and CEOs, but at least has an executive oversight council made up of boards and CEOs that can drive more transformational change in that industry. There are some examples, like the Electric Sector Coordinating Council is made up of all CEOs of some quite large power generation companies, and they've been able to have transformative effects in that industry, and have had transformative effects in making sure the Department of the Energy has the resources to be able to support the sector. Similarly, Department of Treasury have worked with the Financial Sector Coordinating Council. Now, the Sector Coordinating Council for Finance is made up of CISOs and other senior security and risk leaders, but they regularly convene and reach out to the major bank CEOs to get the support they need across the industry. There's some other sectors that really don't have a lot of senior executive involvement, and it frankly, it kind of shows in those sectors. And so what we're doing is essentially saying all of the sector coordinating councils should have regular board and CEO involvement from a representative sample of the owners and operators of that particular critical infrastructure, because it's not just what those CEOs can do in their own companies, it's collectively what they can do to transform an industry and work with the government agencies to influence those agencies having sufficient resources to support that sector. So that's the big impetus behind this.
As it happens, our co-founder of the Cyber Hero V CISO network, Bob Turner, was the field CISO for education. And right after this conversation that we're all having, we're going to be talking with a very important critical infrastructure sector. Bob, I'm not sure what you can say about it, but it certainly is relevant to what Phil is talking about. You're on mute. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm not going to name the specific client that we're going to be talking to, but it is dealing with water provisions, water utility and service provision, which I think is really what we're working on, especially in the critical infrastructure, key resources sectors, and making water utilities safe and secure for their constituents. I think is really important.
Yeah. So Phil, what's your assessment of, without going to, I guess, any particular one, let's say in water, for example, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 water treatment facilities in the United States, something like that. What's your assessment of, let's say, that? I mean, we've had the Colonial Pipeline attack that affected people's gas. We had the JBS meat, hack that affected people's food. I think for this information to cascade out, especially through mid and small size companies, does this have to actually like literally hit home for people to start doing more?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it won't be a surprise. I mean, I don't think our water utilities, for example, you could pick on a number of different other things, are not in great shape from a cyber perspective. I think we've found that illustrated in various public incident and threat intelligence disclosures we've seen over the past few years. And again, this is not a criticism of the people who work in those organizations, or even necessarily the government agencies and departments that work to oversee them. There's a collective shortfall of resources to focus on this problem, and a set of technologies, like I mentioned at the beginning, that they're dealing with that weren't designed for the level of connectivity that is now in place. And so that clearly needs to be fixed. One of the things that we learned in the development of this report that many of you may already know, but we kind of learned about in the report is, you can ask these small companies that run these small water utilities or small electric, distribution providers or other small companies that are mainly private sector organizations supervised and funded by local public organizations. Mm-hmm. They're under severe constraints, and they can't just unilaterally decide to spend more money on this, because those local utility commissions at a state and local level get to set how much they spend. And because this expenditure comes from taxation, so there's an appropriate constraint. They can't just spend arbitrary amounts of money. And so one of the things, again, what we're encouraging in the report is that the commissioners of these local utilities prioritize and work with their stakeholders and constituents in those communities to educate people for the need for extra funding to implement cyber resilience, alongside all of the other things that they want to implement. And so one of the things I think we learned during this report, which we kind of knew anyway, but we really came home, was just how interconnected not just the technology is, but the public policy, the sources of funding, the political oversight that directs who can have funding for what. And the complication of this is not just, we talk about this as US critical infrastructure, but a big part of our utilities are funded and controlled at a state, local, territorial, and tribal community level. So we talk about kind of what the federal government can do, but a lot of the actions happens at the SLTT level in that state, local, territorial, and tribal communities. And the dynamic interplay between the public, the commissioners, the funding of utilities, and the private sector owner operators of certain utilities all has to line up for us to invest more in cyber resilience for those things that are important to us. And so again, this is a community thing that we can all help, not just by talking to our congressman or woman, for example, but by talking to our kind of local councillors, our local communities, our local utility commissions. I think we all have a role to play, educating them about what we, the public, want from them in terms of prioritization.
And as we're forgive the interruption, Bob. I'll come back to you 1 second. If you want to get the report, here's the link that you can get, or you can look it up on Google.
Yeah. Like I say, the great thing about Google, you can find anything on Google. So just do PCAST cyber physical resilience is there.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to bring into this stream, and Bob, let's finish your comment. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Phil's thoughts on whether, because we have the public utility organizations and they have subcontractors that are actually doing the work, what do you think about the third-party risk that is involved in there, not only for the people actually doing the work, but also for those public utility commissions?
Yeah, well, so it's a great point, because I think the supply chain risk is not only a risk, it's actually an opportunity as well, because while we worry about in each of these critical infrastructure industries, there's like an 80-20 concentration, so like there's 20% of companies like affect 80% of the risk because of the concentration of suppliers or software providers, service providers, or other technology providers. And so I think they represent a concentration risk, but they also represent an opportunity, because if we can get things right there, it can have a widespread effect. It always reminds me, and again, I use finance examples because I spent most of my career in finance. You look at the thousands of small community banks across America. They don't run their own technology. They use 4 or 5 big bank IT service providers. You get security right in them. You get security right across thousands of banks, small community banks that don't have the resources themselves. Same things happens in every sector. We're doing some work with the healthcare sector, for example, on looking at what that 80-20 is. What are those small number of companies that affect most of the market, and can we get security right there? So I think that notion of looking at the supply chain for risk, but also looking at the supply chain for opportunity is also a good way of thinking about this.
Thanks for that. Yep, and I want to welcome Steve Garrison as we're just kind of wrapping up here, and I want to just do a shout out to Steve. Thank you so much for helping make all this possible. We are not a non-for-profit, but we don't make any money. So what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
So Steve, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, this was a fantastic discussion. I think this way of thinking about resiliency and SecOps really leverages what happened in networking a long time ago. Redundancy, thinking about failure, planning for failure. This is really essential. So thank you, folks, and thank you, Gary, for bringing such a great webinar. I also want to ask some of my other vendor competitors and partners to step up. The Cyber Hero Network is here to do good, get more virtual CISO services out there. We're proud to be the first sponsor, but I sure hope other people jump in. We are a SecOps platform aimed at enterprises and MSSPs, so we truly believe in the mission. Gary, thanks for having us on, and I'll give you back the microphone. I think that's enough information. People can check us out at stellarcyber.ai.
Well, thanks for sort of the endorsement in the commercial. We've been very fortunate. Maybe we'll do a show to talk about our mission. I wanted to just in the last minute or so here, welcome Kevin. Hey, Kevin, glad you're here.
Well, thank you for having me here. Yes.
So what are your thoughts about everything? There's a lot to unpack here.
Well, I like this opportunity to listen and learn. There's so much experience in this room, and we're sort of just getting started heading down some of the path that all of you are on when it comes to navigating policy and the complexity behind the scenes to call to action. We're in a slightly different mission, but one that probably pains all of you. And that is a part of the small community of people transitioning companies to the new standard for post-quantum cryptography.
Indeed, that is a topic for an important show. And speaking of post-quantum cryptography, George, you're an expert at this. So, by the way, thank you, George, for making all this possible. Phil, thanks so much for who you are and what you do, and most importantly, why you do it. And George, if you want to have the last word.
Well, I don't want anyone to think that I'm an expert in post-quantum cryptography, but I do recognize it as an emerging issue that people need to be prepared for. So, just as the paper goes through and focuses on resilience, I find a lot of the community, the CISOs, the CTOs, the technical directors, focus on that compliance mindset without looking at the emerging threats that are out there and preparing for those type of potential obstacles and challenges. So that's where I focus on the post-quantum cryptography. So don't ask me any questions on superposition or the quantum mechanics behind it.
And I like, if you don't mind, can you just give a quick shout out to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, fdd.org?
So yeah, if you want to follow our work, you can go to fdd.org. It's a small think tank in the DC area. I'm the chief technologist, and I look at those on the horizon kind of issues and the underutilized technologies and processes that enhance cybersecurity for the sake of national security. So it's always an honor to be able to work with the experts and different groups in the community to get the word out on how things can be more secure and more resilient.
Indeed. Phil, you have the last word.
Yeah. So again, I'd like to thank George and the rest of the working group that worked with us on this. And in fact, the several hundred people over the past year that we spoke to in all of the government agencies. One of the things we found, everybody's doing amazing work. Everybody's working really hard. The problems we have are a system problem, not a problem of any one person's effort or responsibility. Everybody's doing great work. All the recommendations about how do we align things up to get that next stage of outcome. And one of the things we're